It was the spring of 1998 when the sleepy town of Mill Creek, Oregon, experienced the darkest day in its history. The town's elementary school had planned a field trip for the 5th grade class. 22 children in total, along with their beloved teacher, Miss Caroline Fisher. The destination was a local history museum about an hour away. Parents waved goodbye that morning, snapping photos and calling out reminders, never imagining that it would be the last time they'd see their children climb aboard that familiar yellow school bus. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the bus pulled out of the school parking lot. Witnesses recall the cheerful sound of children singing, pressing their faces against the glass, and waving excitedly. For the first few miles, several townsfolk reported seeing the bus on the main highway, heading toward the museum as planned. But after that, the bus was never spotted again. Somewhere along a 20-mile stretch of road, in broad daylight, a full-size school bus carrying 23 souls simply vanished. When the bus failed to arrive at the museum, alarms were raised immediately. By early afternoon, frantic parents were gathering at the school demanding answers. Police began a large-scale search that same day. They brought in helicopters, search dogs, and road patrol units. Every possible route was scarred: highways, rural backroads, bridges, and forest trails. Yet there was no sign of the bus, no tire tracks, no debris, not even a skid mark to suggest an accident. It was as though the bus had been swallowed whole by the earth. As the days dragged on, the search grew more desperate. Divers were sent into nearby rivers and lakes, fearing the bus had veered off the road and submerged. Nothing was found. Farmers checked their fields, and loggers combed through the dense forest trails. The state poured resources into the investigation, but the results were always the same: no bus, no children, no answers. Parents were left in unbearable agony, forced to imagine the unthinkable. News of the bizarre disappearance spread quickly across the nation. Reporters flooded Mill Creek, turning the small town into a media circus. Some speculated it was the work of kidnappers or a cult, while others whispered darker theories: paranormal forces, government experiments, or even a cursed stretch of road. But despite endless theories, the truth was simple and horrifying. 22 children and their teacher had vanished without leaving behind a single trace. In the weeks following the disappearance, Mill Creek was consumed by grief and confusion. The schoolyard, once filled with the sound of children's laughter, now echoed only with silence. Parents who once gathered at the gates to pick up their kids, now stood outside in vigil, clutching photographs and asking the same question over and over: how could a bus simply vanish? Authorities gave daily press conferences, but their updates offered nothing more than speculation. Each time the police chief stepped to the microphone, parents held their breath, only to hear him repeat that there were still no new leads. The families grew restless. Mothers formed small groups, trading theories late into the night. Some believed the children had been kidnapped for ransom, but no demands ever came. Others wondered if the bus driver had suffered a breakdown and taken the children somewhere remote, though investigators insisted they'd found no evidence of such. The uncertainty was a slow kind of torture, and every day without answers deepened the wounds. Sleep became impossible for many, and the sound of a phone ringing in the middle of the night made hearts stop, always hoping it would be news. But it never was. Margaret Lane, whose 10-year-old son Daniel had been among the missing, quickly emerged as the most determined of all the parents. While others clung to the faint hope that the children might eventually return, Margaret refused to accept vague reassurances. She pored over maps, retraced possible routes herself, and even interviewed locals who had been along the highway that morning. To her, something about the official reports didn't add up. She believed there was a piece of the puzzle hidden in plain sight, something everyone had overlooked. As the months dragged on, tension among the families began to grow. Some parents, exhausted by grief, eventually packed up and moved away, unable to endure the constant reminders in Mill Creek. Others turned their frustration on the authorities, demanding to know why the search had yielded nothing. Rumors spread that officials were withholding information, that perhaps they knew more than they were letting on. But Margaret remained. She refused to leave the house where Daniel had grown up, convinced that if there were ever a breakthrough, she had to be there to see it. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, Margaret returned to the empty schoolyard with a bouquet of white lilies. She would place them at the gates where she last saw her son climb aboard the bus. Locals began to avoid the area on those days, unsettled by her devotion and the heavy atmosphere of loss. Yet for Margaret, it was never a ritual of mourning, it was a vow. She promised herself that until her last breath, she would not stop searching for the truth, even if she was the only one still asking questions. Nearly 3 decades after the disappearance, when most of the world had moved on, Margaret Lane's doorbell rang on an ordinary gray morning. On her porch sat a small, weathered package with no return address. The handwriting on the front was shaky and faded, almost as if written in haste by someone who did not want to be recognized. With trembling hands, Margaret tore open the paper and found a single Polaroid photograph inside, its edges warped and its colors dulled by time. The moment her eyes locked onto the image, her breath caught in her throat. The photograph showed the missing school bus. Its once bright yellow paint looked darker, as though covered in dust or shadows. Inside, through the smeared windows, she could see the children, every one of them. They weren't smiling or waving as they had been when they left the schoolyard. Instead, they sat rigidly, their faces pale and unfocused, like faded imprints of themselves. It was as though the camera had captured not just their appearance, but their fear. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what she was looking at. Undeniable proof that the children had still been alive after the day they vanished. But the most unsettling part of the image was not the children themselves. As Margaret tilted the photo under the light, she noticed a faint reflection in the glass of the bus window. A figure stood outside, tall and shadowy, its features too blurred to identify. It was positioned near the bus door, as if guarding it, or keeping the children inside. The longer Margaret stared at it, the colder the room seemed to become, as if the figure's presence extended beyond the photograph itself. She forced herself to look away, her instincts screaming that there was something deeply wrong about it. Shaken, she examined the back of the photograph, hoping for a clue about who had sent it. In faded ink, a date was scrawled: April 16, 1998. Margaret froze. That was 2 full days after the children and their teacher had gone missing. The discovery made her knees buckle. If the date was real, it meant the bus hadn't vanished into thin air, not immediately. The children had been somewhere, still alive, long after the town had given up hope. The question was where? Margaret rushed to the local police station, clutching the photo like it was her last lifeline. But when investigators examined it, their faces showed only annoyance. They dismissed it as a cruel prank, a fabricated image sent by someone eager to reopen old wounds. They filed it away as unverified evidence, and told Margaret not to dwell on it. Yet deep in her gut, she knew it was real. The photo was not a prank, it was a message. Someone out there knew the truth about the missing children, and after 27 years of silence, they had chosen to remind her that the nightmare was far from over. Margaret couldn't shake the photograph from her mind. Every detail of it gnawed at her, especially the date on the back. If the bus was seen 2 days later, it meant someone, somewhere, had hidden it. One night, unable to sleep, she spread old county maps across her kitchen table. She compared the official bus route with what locals remembered from decades ago. That's when she noticed something strange on older maps. There was an additional road branching off the main highway. It was a narrow, winding logging road, marked in faded ink. But on newer maps, it was gone, erased as if it had never existed. Her curiosity led her to the town's library, where dusty records confirmed her suspicion. The logging road had been officially closed just 3 days after the class disappeared. No reason was given, only a vague note about unsafe conditions. Margaret's hands trembled as she traced the line of the forgotten road with her finger. It was the perfect detour, hidden from plain sight. If the bus driver had mistakenly turned down it, or worse, been forced onto it, it could explain why no one ever saw them again. The timing of the closure felt too deliberate, too coincidental. Determined to see it for herself, Margaret drove out toward the stretch of highway where the road once branched off. Decades of neglect had covered its entrance with thick brush and fallen trees. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a wall of greenery. But when she stepped closer, she saw the faint outline of cracked asphalt peeking through the moss. Her heart raced as she realized she was standing at the mouth of a path erased from memory, one that might still hold the answers. The deeper she pushed into the overgrowth, the more unsettling it became. The silence in the forest felt unnatural, heavy, as if even the birds refused to sing there. The air was cooler, damp, carrying the faint scent of rust and earth. Margaret's footsteps echoed strangely, the crunch of leaves sounding louder than they should. She thought about the children walking this same path, or rather, being driven down it, and a chill ran down her spine. What had they seen? What had they felt? The idea that 22 small voices had once echoed here made her throat tighten. By the time she emerged at a clearing, Margaret's legs were shaking. Before her lay the remains of what must have been an old barricade, splintered wooden beams, and a weathered sign that once read, "Road closed." The barricade looked hastily built, as though someone had wanted to seal the road in a hurry. She crouched down, brushing dirt from the faded sign, and for a brief second she thought she heard something. A faint creak, like the groan of old tires shifting under unseen weight. She froze, heart hammering, and whispered to herself, "This is where it happened." As Margaret continued to explore the forgotten road, she quickly realized why people in Mill Creek rarely spoke of it. The woods that surrounded the path felt different, unnervingly still, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Yet it wasn't silence that unnerved her the most. It was the faint sounds that broke it. On more than one occasion, she thought she heard the distant echo of children's laughter drifting between the trees. At first, she told herself it was her imagination, the product of exhaustion and grief. But the more time she spent there, the more convinced she became that the voices were real. Other locals had whispered similar accounts. Hikers who strayed too close to the overgrown entrance claimed to hear strange noises at night. Laughter, crying, even the hum of an engine. A retired logger told Margaret he had once seen faint lights flickering deep in the woods, like headlights weaving through the trees where no vehicle could possibly drive. He admitted he never returned after that. It wasn't just strange, he told her in a hushed voice. Hoot felt wrong. Like the forest didn't want me there. His words only strengthened Margaret's resolve. One evening, Margaret decided to test it for herself. She parked her car by the main road and walked into the woods as darkness fell. The deeper she went, the colder the air became. Her flashlight beam flickered across tree trunks, and every snap of a twig underfoot made her heart leap. Then it came, the unmistakable sound of children giggling, faint but clear. Her chest tightened as she spun in circles, trying to locate the source, but the laughter seemed to move, bouncing from tree to tree, as though the forest itself was carrying it. The sounds didn't stop there. Just as suddenly, the laughter turned to crying. Low, pitiful sobs, like children begging for help, seeped through the darkness. Margaret's throat constricted. She wanted to call out Daniel's name, but fear held her voice hostage. Then, in the distance, she saw a glow. A pair of lights shining faintly in the blackness. They flickered like headlights, weaving through the trees at an impossible angle, too high to belong to a car on any road. Her stomach dropped. The lights lingered, then vanished, leaving her in suffocating darkness once more. Margaret stumbled back toward her car, shaken to the core. She couldn't explain what she had heard, or what she had seen, but she knew one thing: the forgotten road was not empty. Something lingered there, trapped between time and reality. And if the voices she heard truly belonged to the missing children, then their story wasn't over. It was still being played out in the shadows of the forest. Over and over again. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret sat alone at her kitchen table, with the Polaroid photo laid out in front of her. The faint reflection of the tall, shadowy figure haunted her, but something else tugged at her attention. She retrieved a magnifying glass and leaned in closer, studying every corner of the photograph. Her hands trembled as she examined the pale faces of the children, the blurred windows, the grainy textures of the bus. Then, her eyes froze on a single detail. A bright red band wrapped around the wrist of one of the boys near the window. Her heart stopped. That boy was her son Daniel. Margaret remembered the wristband vividly, because she had helped him make it the morning of the field trip. Daniel had insisted on wearing something lucky, so he had braided a thin band of red string from spools in his father's old workshop. She could still recall the look of pride on his face as he tied it around his wrist before running out the door. It was no store-bought accessory, it was unique, homemade, and unmistakable. There was no way anyone else could have been wearing it. That small piece of string confirmed what she already suspected: the photo was real, and her son had been alive when it was taken. The discovery shook her to the core. If the photograph was truly dated 2 days after the disappearance, it meant that Daniel and the other children had not died instantly. They had been alive, trapped somewhere, perhaps even close to Mill Creek. But what chilled her even more was the possibility that they might still be there, caught in a place no one had dared to search. She gripped the photo so tightly her knuckles turned white, whispering to herself, "I knew you were still out there." Margaret rushed down to her basement workshop, the same place where Daniel had crafted the band. Dust coated the shelves, and the faint smell of old wood lingered in the air. On a workbench, long forgotten, lay the spools of red string Daniel had used that very morning, untouched for 27 years. She picked one up and felt an icy shiver course through her body. For the briefest moment, she swore she heard a sound behind her, soft, faint, like children's voices murmuring from the shadows. The string slipped from her hands as the whispers grew clearer, brushing against her ears like a memory refusing to fade. The connection was undeniable. The wristband in the photo wasn't just a symbol of her son. It was a tether, proof that objects tied to the children's final day might still hold a link to them. If the red string had carried through time, perhaps it was more than a simple keepsake. Perhaps it was the key to understanding where the children had gone. Margaret clutched the spool to her chest, her heart racing with a mix of fear and hope. For the first time in 27 years, she felt closer to the truth than ever before. Margaret stood frozen in her basement, the spool of red string trembling in her grip. The whispers that brushed past her ears refused to fade, faint and fragmented, like voices carried through water. She strained to listen, and among the murmurs, she thought she recognized a name, Daniel. Her blood ran cold. It was impossible, and yet the sound was so familiar, so heartbreakingly real. She staggered backward, her eyes darting around the dimly lit room, but there was no one there. Only the creaking pipes above and the chilling sense that she was not alone. Then came another sound, low and steady, the unmistakable rumble of an engine. It wasn't outside on the street, but beneath her feet, vibrating faintly through the floorboards. She pressed her ear against the cold concrete, and felt her stomach lurch. It was the sound of a bus engine idling in the distance, muffled and ghostly, as though it were waiting in some place just beyond reach. Margaret's heart pounded violently in her chest. The bus wasn't gone. It was still out there, somewhere. She lifted the photo once more, her eyes fixed on Daniel's wristband. A horrifying thought struck her. What if the children weren't dead at all? What if they had been pulled into something else? Another place, another layer of reality, where time didn't move the same way. That would explain the laughter in the woods, the headlights in the trees, and the photograph, appearing nearly 3 decades later. They weren't memories or echoes. They were fragments of a nightmare that had never ended. Margaret collapsed into a chair, her mind racing. If the children were trapped, were they suffering? Could they feel the passage of time? Or worse, were they stuck in a loop, reliving the moment of their disappearance over and over for eternity? Her hands shook violently as she remembered the barricade on the forgotten road, the way it had looked hastily thrown together. Someone had known about this. Someone had tried to seal the entrance, not to protect the town, but to hide what had truly happened. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just murmurs now. They were clear, desperate voices. "Help us." Margaret dropped the string, her heart thundering as the basement light flickered violently overhead. For a moment, she thought she saw movement in the corner, a blur of small faces staring back at her, eyes hollow and pleading. She blinked, and they were gone. But the cold realization settled deep in her chest. The children had never left Mill Creek. They were still here, trapped between worlds, waiting for someone to finally bring them home. And so, the mystery of the missing class remains unsolved. 27 years have passed, yet their absence still lingers over Mill Creek like a shadow that refuses to lift. Some believe the bus veered off the forgotten road and was swallowed by the earth. Others whisper it was taken somewhere far darker, to a place where time itself doesn't flow the same way. But Margaret's discovery changed everything. The photograph, the red wristband, the whispers in the basement. These weren't just signs of the past. They were proof that the children never truly left. Their laughter still echoes in the woods. Their cries still pierce the silence, and the bus still waits on a road no map dares to show. To this day, hikers claim to hear the sound of an engine idling in the distance, headlights flickering where no vehicle can drive. Some say if you walk too far into the forest, you may see the outlines of children pressing their faces against foggy glass, silently pleading for someone to notice them. And maybe, just maybe, the next person who takes that forgotten road will finally uncover the truth. But one thing is certain, the children of Mill Creek are not gone. They are waiting, watching, and their story is far from over.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.